بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So in the previous weeks of this Chai Day, we've been going through this book, المشوق إلى القراءة وطلب العلم, the motivator to reading and seeking knowledge. And previously we were mentioning a lot of the stories of the scholars and how they traveled for knowledge, how they would study the same book multiple times, and how they would teach the same book multiple times, and a number of other stories. And now we're towards the end of the book, Bismillah. So the author, he says in the 7th chapter, في نسخ الكتب وما تحملوه في ذلك. He mentions incidents of the scholars when it came to doing naskh of the books. Naskh basically means, back in the day they never used to have printers. So if they wanted a book, what did they have to do? They'd have to write it out by hand. Right? So if they saw, for example, this book and somebody else wanted a copy of this book, right? They couldn't go to the bookstore and just buy a book, right? They had to take this book off that person and just copy the whole thing out. And once they've copied it all out, they would give it back to that person. So in this chapter, the author mentions a number of incidents of ulama when it came to them doing this. And sometimes it wasn't even for a book that they've not read. Sometimes it's a book that they've authored themselves. But obviously if they authored it, they've only got one copy. So then they will write out their own book a number of times just so that there are more copies. So for example, it's narrated by Imam al-Dhahabi rahimahullah that he did so with his book Sir A'lam al-Nubala. For those that know, it's a number of volumes depending on the print, 15 volumes, 20 volumes depending on the print. So that's his own book that he authored. He had to write it out a number of times. And for that reason, you'll find that the ulama, they were very quick when it came to writing. So it's narrated, for example, Ismail ibn Zayd, every night he would write 70 pages. Each night, 70 pages. بِخَطٍ دَقِيق, with small handwriting as well. It's not like big handwriting. Small handwriting, and he would write 70 pages. Likewise, it's narrated that Ahmad ibn Abd al-Da'im al-Maqdisi, he wrote the book Mukhtasar al-Khiraqi, the whole book in one night. Likewise, Al-Mughni, which is also 15 volumes, he copied that book out a number of times, and so on. And then the author, he does mention other incidents similar to this, and then towards the end, after mentioning a number of those incidents, he says, Subhanallah, ينسخ هذه الكتب هذا العدد من المرات ولو كلف أحدنا قراءتها بنحو هذا العدد لعجز فلا قوة إلا بالله. That Subhanallah, these people would copy out books this number of times. If we were told to read that same book even once, we wouldn't be able to read it. If I said the Mughni, which is 15 volumes, read that book once. Most of us probably won't finish the first volume. But they would write it out a number of times. Why? Because they were in need. If they wanted to read that book, they can't take the book of that person, that's theirs. But they would take it off them and copy it out just so that they can have their own copy. So it's not as easy as it is now. We take it for granted going to a bookstore. Or even sometimes you don't have to leave the house, you can order it online. Dar Makkah, Sifat al-Safa, whatever the websites are, right? And like that, the author mentions a number of other stories until the end of the chapter. And now we come to the final chapter, chapter number 8, إيقاظات وتنبيهات. After mentioning all of these stories and all these incidents of the scholars, which should have, inshallah, motivated us to learn more and to put more effort into learning, he finishes off by mentioning a number of general advices which are important regarding seeking knowledge and regarding learning. Now obviously he didn't mention all of them because there are separate books that mention all of the advices regarding how to learn and so on. So he just mentions at the end of this book one chapter, and I believe he mentions 5 general points. The first point is that he advises us to focus on those sciences which have the most importance. And those sciences are those sciences which are based upon the Quran and Sunnah. So for example, and then he carries on to explain, it's those things that a person needs to know, and it's obligatory upon him. So for example, if there's a person who does not know how to pray, and then there are 2 classes going on, there's an Arabic class, and there's a class on how to pray. For this person, which class should he go to? The prayer, right? Okay, does that mean now we're belittling the Arabic language, belittling the importance of learning language of the Quran? No, we're not belittling it, but for this person, what's more important? How to pray, because he needs to pray 5 times a day, and that's obligatory upon him as the second pillar of Islam, and so on. Right? So likewise, we should be focusing on those things which are the most important to us. So sometimes you'll find that we're busy with debating people on certain issues or answering doubts. These doubts and these issues, they never finish. You finish with one, another one comes up. You finish with that one, another one comes up. We should be focusing on the principles, on the basics, so that we have a solid foundation, so that if many doubts come, we can answer all of them with the same principles that we have. So for example, when it comes to the basics in fiqh, for example, how to pray, the pillars of the salah, the conditions of the salah, we need to learn these things. So many times I get asked a question, Ustadh, I've done this in my salah, I've done this in my salah, I did this in salah, what's the ruling, right? And it's not like I have to do extra research regarding this particular issue. I just go back to the principles of the salah. If it's something from the pillars, I can give an answer according to that. If it's something from the conditions, I give an answer according to that. Likewise when it comes to aqeedah, likewise when it comes to hadith and all of the other sciences. So the author, he advises to focus on that which is the most important. And then after focusing on that which is the most important, that which is obligatory upon you, that which will take you closer to Allah, then there's no problem in a person going to different sciences and learning the other sciences. And he also indicates that everyone is on different levels. You know, everyone intellectually, everyone's different. The amount of time that people have is different. The amount of determination people have is different. So there's not one answer that fits all the people. They study this much amount a week, this much a week. Everyone knows their capability. But what I would say is that this should go back to your teacher. Right? So how much you study, what exactly you study, you go back to your teacher and he'll advise you, right, do this and do that. Because he knows you, he knows what you can do, he knows what you have studied, and he'll advise you with that which is appropriate. The second piece of advice is that he mentions how just because certain sciences may be more important, that doesn't mean that a person, he neglects the other sciences. Okay? So for example, somebody may say aqeedah is the most important. Without a doubt, study that first. But then that doesn't mean you neglect the other science. You neglect fiqh, for example, which is how to pray, how to give zakah, who to give zakah to, fasting, hajj, buying and selling, right? Likewise, hadith is the hadith is one of the most important. But then you'll find people who say hadith, but then they'll neglect the other sciences, which there could be things in those other sciences which are obligatory upon them. And somebody who's busying himself with hadith might be studying those hadiths which are obligatory upon him at this moment. They're like the extra piece of information. But there might be something in the other sciences, in aqeedah or in fiqh or in any of the other sciences which may be obligatory upon him. So the second piece of advice that the author mentions is that just because you're focusing on a certain science, it doesn't mean that you neglect the other sciences. In fact, a person becomes stronger in his knowledge the more the more sciences that he learns. And an example of this is, for example, if you're looking at a picture, but you only look, let's say, with one eye, right? You can see the picture. Or, for example, you look at it from one certain angle. That is not the same as a person who looks at the same picture with both eyes, or that he looks at it from different angles. Or, for example, you're going to buy a car, a person looks at it from the front. It's not the same as somebody who can look at it from the front and from the back and from the sides. The one who looks at from all of the different angles has a much better picture. Likewise, knowledge of Islam. Person who looks at it just from one lens or one science may know quite a bit, but the same picture, he won't have the same picture as somebody who studies all of the other sciences. And then the third piece of advice is that the Shaykh, he mentions that a person has to combine between studying with a teacher and reading from books. He has to have both. Okay? In the beginning, more so with the teacher, and the more he learns, then he can start reading himself a bit more from the books. And the author, he continues, mentioning this point in a bit of detail. The fourth piece of advice is that the author, he mentions a person needs to acknowledge that there are different types of books and different types of reading. There are some books that you study, then there are some books that you memorize, then there are some books that you just go back to as references. So voluminous books, you don't need to read the whole book, but it's just a reference. Certain issue comes, you go back to that book just to search that issue in that particular book. And then there are some books which you can just read fast, and then there are some books that you got to sit down, read it again and again, highlight, circle, and everything else, and properly study it. So a person needs to acknowledge the different level of different books so that he can correctly benefit from each of the books. And the fifth and final advice that the Shaykh mentions in his book is taqeed al-fawaid, capturing the benefits. I.e., when a person does read a book, it's not enough for a person just to read and that's it. But at the same time, anytime he comes across a benefit or a proof or a definition or anything which he seems to be important, he should write it down. Or the wording that the ulama use is to capture it, right? Because you can read it and then you're going to forget. But if you write it down, capture it, summarize it, that's what will allow you to keep that benefit with you. And that's what the Shaykh mentions. And alhamdulillah, with that we've completed this book, Al-Mashawwiq ila-Qira'ati wa Talib al-Ilm. And all praise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who allowed us to finish this book. Inshallah, I've not decided which is the next book, but inshallah we'll start a new book from next Friday, bi'ithnillah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us beneficial knowledge, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to follow in the footsteps of these great scholars. Subhanakallah wa hamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Yeah, there's also tea as well in the side room, so anybody who wants any refreshments or tea can go into the side room, bi'ithnillah.